from the hinterland of Constantinople, and most recently a project funded by Livium in Edinburgh with my colleagues Martin Crapper, Simon Smith, Riley Snyder, Kate Ward, and Francesca Ruggieri, with the assistance of Kerim Altu of the Istanbul Büyükşehir Belediye. Some of the publications, all the publications to date, are listed in the latest SPBS, and you can see what outputs we've made in a variety of areas. So what I'm talking about today, in part, arises from that, and the second part arises from an application in terms of geoarchaeology, and with colleagues from the University of Mainz and the University of Innsbruck. It was a very fortuitous circumstances, which we don't have time to go into, that we were able to recover a series of samples of sinter or carbonates, which enabled these to be analyzed. And this is now appearing in the next issue of Geoarchaeology. So that's the final point which I shall mention. In order to provide the city of Constantinople with sufficient water, as the city grew, and we know this from various sources in the course of the 4th century, the complaints about the lack of water, and that was really what I meant by Constantine's legacy. It's a city with a wonderful situation, perhaps a little proximate to the Danube frontiers, but in terms of communications and elsewhere, it's a marvelous and remains a marvelous urban setting. But the city in the 4th century and the 5th century, and the city today of 17 million, still faces profound problems of water provision, because there is no local water sources, unlike Rome and other cities in the ancient world. So it was necessary then to create the longest Roman water supply line, as Professor Kazim Chechen wrote in his 1996 volume, the first really attempt to document the system as a whole. This built on work of a number of scholars, and I always want to mention Feridun Diemtekin, who published in 1958 and in 1968 about the water supply, although Roman aqueduct fans ignore all of these publications until very recently. And then we published our water supply volume in 2008. So it's a gravity-fed system. Water flows downhill from springs, and the springs become significant in the second part. And the channels, and you can see standing in the central image there, Professor Paolo Bono, and he also figures again in the second part. But here, an image with water sources and springs, karst springs, water running gently downhill, provided by through the force of gravity into the city itself. And you can see there at the Istanbul Kürkçeşme fountains, the reuse of a Byzantine fountain as recorded at the beginning of the 20th century. The water flowed along channels, and these channels take a variety of forms. They're to be found in the forests to the west of Istanbul. And there's the entrance to a channel on the left, within a channel on the bottom right, and a raised channel at the top right. They are substantial structures, and the overall the overall requirement of construction has been studied by Riley Snyder and is listed on our bibliography. The countryside is demanding for a major infrastructure project. The channels had to sinuously wind their way through the hills, the wooded hills of Thrace. And across the valleys, there were great bridges. This is a view looking eastwards towards, on the top, the far ridge, the line of the Anastasian wall, the line of the water channels in the foreground, and in the distance, the greatest of all the aqueduct bridges at Kurşunlu, here with the telephoto view and the sort of the tree line at the top. That's the Anastasian wall beyond. The channels flow across the hillsides. And here at Kurşunlu, modeled by Riley Snyder, you can see the line of two such channels, one slightly higher than the other. And what these represent are the two major phases of the construction of the aqueduct system. Kurşunluğumi is the greatest of the aqueducts, 135 meters in width, over 35 meters in height. These are amongst the most substantial great water bridges in the Roman world. The system evolved over time. Byzantium had a small aqueduct using the resources in the forest of Belgrade to the north of the city. The first phase in the 4th century extended the water supply system out towards Danamandara and Pinarca. And here you can see it there. This system then in the 5th century was extended much further beyond Vise. Jordan Pickett will be talking a little later this morning about some really interesting results from analysis of speleotherms at Uzuntarla, which is just above Vise. And then in the later Byzantine period and in the Ottoman period, the sources were again sourced much closer to the city, and that's a theme we shall come back to. Now, when we published the 2008 volume and subsequent publications, we didn't really resolve, I don't think, the issue of whether the two lines, as they became closer to the city, where they were running not just parallel, but actually at equivalent height, whether they were both running at the same time. And there are still some issues about this. But near the bridge at Büyükgeme and the bridge at Kumalidere, it's possible to see that in the first phase, the 4th century phase, the aqueduct channels took longer routes up into the hills, and then latterly, this route was then abandoned or was replaced by shorter, much larger bridges. And there's not time to go into all the details of these, but these include such as Kurşunluğumi. Now, the construction of these bridges is, particularly in the second phase, is characterized by the use of a very robust rusticated masonry. It's not ashlar, but it's very well built and mortar. And this is a really resilient form of construction. What we didn't bring out was the distinction between the scale of the bridges between phase 1 and phase 2. On the right, you can see the aqueduct of Valens, the Bozdoğan in Constantinople. And there you can see that the piers are 4.5 meters in width, and the arch space is 3.5 meters. This is different if we were to go into a comparison with, say, the Pont du Gard in southern France. At the same time, it's a pretty standard Eastern Mediterranean aqueduct bridge. But when we look at Kurşunluğumi, which you can see to the left, you can see that the space of the arch is 6 meters wide, but the width of the scale of the overall piers are much, much bigger. And this is equally the actual width of the bridge, not the length of the bridge, but the width of the bridge is also much more substantial. Now, Kurşunluğumi, at nearly 40 meters in height, is the largest of all the bridges. But other bridges, of which there are 5 of this scale, are also much larger than the bridges of the first phase. And also, and I've spoken many times about this before, also about the associated at Kurşunluğumi is the exceptional variety of Christian symbols which are littered about the monument. Well, they're not littered, they're quite specifically placed, particularly at the spring arches and other places, and I think have essentially a protective, prepared symbol. Now, why should this be? The suggestion, which I don't think we really looked into, although we did attempt to involve seismologists over 20 years ago, more than that actually, at a conference in the Royal Academy with geologists and archaeologists. What we hadn't really been able to see was the impact of the fact that the bridges lie within an earthquake zone. Now, the other of of the failings or the potential threats to Constantinople, Istanbul, is that its situation on the North Anatolian fault zone, which you can see there. And it's only 21 years ago that there was the very catastrophic earthquake at Izmit, which did have some impact on Constantinople. And Byzantine historians, of course, are aware of the constant threat of earthquakes posed to the city of Constantinople itself. But what I hadn't appreciated until I started to look into it was, in fact, there's another fault zone, less significant than the Northern Anatolian fault, which is known as the Kuklareli fault zone here, and is the Eskişehir fault zone down here, and is running in basically a southeast to northwest direction, sort of across the line of the Sea of Marmara. And you can see it reflected in this slide here. Now, we haven't got time to compare maps, but you can see fairly clearly this is the town of Sarai. In fact, this line there and the known instance of relatively small seismic activity corresponds almost precisely with the course of the Aquarak channels. Now, this potentially then gives us an occasion of why the aqueducts should have been constructed so significantly, or reconstructed so significantly in the second phase. Now, in the standard list of earthquakes for Constantinople, which Downey produced, this particular reference does not occur. It's in Marcellinus Comes, and Marcellinus Comes is talking about Europa. Now, Europa was just thought to mean, Europe. But of course, I don't think it does mean that. What it actually means is the province of Europa, which is, of course, immediately adjacent to the city of Constantinople. In other words, it's more or less cognate with the area we recognize as Turkish Thrace. And of course, that again is the area through which our aqueducts pass. So if there was a major earthquake or series of earthquakes in Europa, in Turkish Thrace, in Eastern Thrace, in the latter part of 394, right at the end of the 4th century, this may well be the occasion which created the need to replace this bridge, because this is the remains of the period 1 bridge at Kurşunögeme, by this bridge in a much more robust and resilient form. So that's one instance where we see the impact of the environment, in this case, a hazardous environment, in terms of the maintenance of the water supply system. The second one occurs in the 6th century. And here we see the one inscription that survives from any of the aqueducts which tells us anything. I mean, there are a number of texts on Kurşunögeme, but they are all in the nature of Kyria Boethi and so forth. This one is the only example which gives us the name of an individual, Longinus, the former consul, and the former prefect and consul of Constantinople. We know that Longinus, in the reign of Justinian, was prefect between 537 to 542. He was also responsible for the final work on the Yerebatansaray, the basilica system, in paving the system. And here you can see the line of the inscription along the top. There's the bridge. And also you'll recognize those more alert at this time of the morning that the construction methods used and associated with this inscription are somewhat different from the ones that I showed you a couple of slides ago from Kurşunögeme. And also we have these inverted imposts in terms of lots of details which are quite different from the sort of bridges that we see in the first and the second phase. Now, during the reign of Justinian, we know from Procopius that work was carried out in order to restore the Anastasian wall. We also know from Theophanes that the emperor Justinian, this isn't in Procopius, we also know from Theophanes that Justinian went to Selymbria in order to oversee the restoration of the wall after damage created by the earthquake of 557-558, which of course had a disastrous impact on the first dome of Hagia Sophia. So, and of course, it is in precisely this area. That's the line of the Anastasian wall running from north to south, from the Sea of Marmara, from the Black Sea to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, And this is the line of the aqueduct which runs through it. And significantly, it's precisely in this area where we see evidence for this Justinianic, if I've used inverted commas, you can't see me making that sort of symbol, but between that's where the inscription is, El Kafdere. Down here, there's another example of Büyük Göme, Talas I'll be talking about, and Lukadere. And these bridges are again different. So this is the second phase major bridge at Talas, which is then restored with this huge wall across it. And this is the largest of the rebuilt Justinianic bridges. And on the right, we can see a similar, notice this particular characteristic form of buttressing. This is the bridge at Lukadere, again, restoration. And significantly, there's no mention of any of this work to the aqueduct system in the De Aedificiis, for instance. And in fact, much of, apart from the works within the city, the basilica system, and one or two other references in Procopius, it's only in the secret history that we have references to droughts and problems with the water supply, and that's a separate issue. So what I hope I've been able to demonstrate is that both in the very end of the 4th century and in the 6th century, one of the major problems was to ensure not just the continuing maintenance, but was the restoration, the large-scale restoration of the water supply, both in the 4th into the 5th century, completed probably by the 5th century, if not a little earlier. But interestingly, we have no references in our written sources, where we have lots of references to the initial construction. And in the 6th century, again, almost complete silence from our written sources, for what I think is a pretty extensive campaign of restoration in order to sustain water towards the city. In the second part, I just want to move on quite quickly to consider the results and to summarize the results of what my scientific colleagues, Gül Semelihindi and Kees Pasquier of University of Mainz, have been able to do. The images on the left show two different channels. One is the narrow channel of the 4th century system, and one is the large channel of the 5th century system, second phase, near to Balaguer. The individual standing in them is the same. It's Professor Paolo Bono, who died years ago. And Paolo was a wonderful man who was a hydrogeologist, and anything I know about water, I learned doing fieldwork with Paolo. Paolo collected a number of samples of sinter, or carbonates, which accumulate on the sides of the channels. There are no examples there, although I'll show you an example shortly. We sort of lost touch, and Paolo's death was quite sudden and quite shocking. Well, it was so unexpected. And I made some inquiries, but I was told that there was nothing had survived from the samples that he'd taken. However, it emerged that in fact he'd given them a couple of years before to Kees Pasquier in Mainz. And as part of the Leverhulme project, we were able to ensure the proper study of these samples. The samples come from, particularly from Pinaja down here, and from out towards Pazarle. These are the Eocene limestones where the water rises, these sort of yellow areas. And notice also these springs down here. This is a new map created by the Mainz team for the Geoarchaeology publication. So this shows the springs are near to the village of Ivergic, and also the other supplementary springs at Ergene, which I'll also be talking about. And these are the samples C6, C4, C5, and so forth. So let's think, this is, we're back in the same sort of area. There's Sarai, there's Vise again, and that's the start of the system at Pazarla. And just outside Vise is, you can see here, there's the channel mortar, the mortar which was needed to ensure that there was proper flow. And the channel here is relatively small. It became much wider when we went, as we get towards Balagema, where that other slide derived from. This is an example. This is Paolo's Geological Map Trace, which we published in 2001. And these are some of the springs at Inarja. And there are deliberate, there's underground water channels which are properly connected. It's a wonderful system. It's not in such good order. I haven't been there for a few years. I went there about 5-6 years ago, and it unfortunately has not survived quite so well. But this is what it's all about. It's this material here. And here you can see the one side of a channel which has otherwise been disturbed near to Ergene. So this is one side of the channel. The other side of the channel is over here to the left. And then it would have been vaulted as the ones that I've shown you. But this is the accumulation of carbonates, sometimes sinter, which you can see. So that's the original mortar of the side of the channel. And this is how it's expanded and the carbonates are built up over time. And that's what the team from Mainz and Austria have been looking at. So what is a carbonate or a sinter? It's generally a deposit in aqueduct channels which are absent or thin near to the spring, but they reach maximum thickness at some distance from the spring, depending on the supersaturation and the degassing rate. And then further along, as we get closer towards the city, they're thinner again. So there are only certain areas along the length of the channel where you actually get the deposition of carbonates. It's not uniform. And this pattern is due to the degassing of the CO2 from water, leading to supersaturation and the on-site precipitation of calcite deposition, which is followed by a decrease in the deposition rate when the CO2 concentration in the water approaches equilibrium with the atmospheric carbon dioxide. The thickness of the deposits and the fine and coarse crystalline nature of the fabric depends on the deposition rate as well as biological activity, with denser and coarser crystalline calcites being deposited in faster flowing water. And what Jordan Pickett will be talking, he'll be talking about speleothems, which are essentially stalactites and stalagmites, which are in a sense a very natural deposit, instead of these which are sort of in a sense man-derived because they're created through the construction of aqueduct channels. What Jordan will be talking about is speleothems. So what were the conclusions from the geoarchaeology? Now, the paper is densely scientific, much of which I do not follow. So all I'm doing is simply characterizing from their conclusions, just to using stable aerostate data. This was carried out by Professor Spertel in Innsbruck. It shows, particularly for the remember we've got two channels, one of which coming from the far west, from Pazala near to Ergene, and the second one, which belongs to the first phase. There's only one sample from that, which is to the south. But where the majority come from that's from the 5th century system, but not date. I'll come back to that. Here we see a regular cyclicity, probably in response to seasonal temperature changes in the long aqueduct channel. And this cyclicity allows the counting of annual layers when you carry out thin section analysis. So the stable isotope profiles in the 5th century channel show carbonates with only a weak the channel carbonates show only a weak and variable correlation, probably in response to an evenly distributed rainfall over the year in Thrace. And significantly, the point they make is that this is quite different from the characteristic you get in lots of other Eastern Mediterranean aqueduct channels further to the south. And so it does demonstrate a sort of climatic difference between what is in Thrace, what you, for instance, get in southern Turkey. And they talk about, they've carried out work on a number of major aqueducts there. So there is a significant difference then in the distribution of the rainfall. The chronology of the data I'll come back to. The stable isotope profiles from the 4th century channel show covariance and therefore differ significantly from the stable isotope profiles of the 5th century channel. And this possibly will reflect seasonal variations, which in turn can be related to the smaller size of the aquifer of the 4th century channels rather than the larger size aquifer of the 5th century channels. I'll point these out again in a second. And then finally, the water in the 5th century channel was commonly contaminated with clay. And the large strategic open water storage basins of Aetius, Asper, and Mochius, which are within the Theodosian walls, but not within the Constantinian line, within the city, may have had the additional function to allow clay particles. That's just one aspect, but it's an interesting perspective on how we understand the function of those great containers. So the carbonate deposits in the 5th century aqueduct represent a maximum of 27 years of deposition, which must occur during the last decades of activity of the water supply system in the later part of the 12th century. So since the aqueduct was in use for several centuries, this implies that the aqueduct channel was cleaned, possibly regularly. The 4th century branch contains at least 14 years of deposits that may date back to an even later period. And you can see on the right the sort of samples. These are the 4th century samples down on the bottom right, and the rest of these are the samples from the 5th century aqueduct. And you can see the different, this is the analysis and the various forms that this study has been based on. So in conclusion then, in terms of what we can learn from this study, I show this really impressive chart showing the life of the water supply of the city from the Hadrian aqueduct to the first phase, the aqueduct of Valens, the second phase constructed by the middle of the 5th century when it's extended to Pasale, then the break. Remember, in this period, it is being maintained despite major seismic problems, which is what I've implied. Then we have a cut. This is historically attested from Theophanes at the time of the Avrar siege in 626, the restoration under Constantine V, and then finally the reduction in the size of the aqueduct system after the time of the Comnenian emperors. We know from our studies that there are several different phases which can be recognized. This is the Great Bridge of Byzantium, and you can see here how the first phase belonging to the 5th century was then reduced, and we have no specific evidence, independent evidence, to say this is 8th century, but the comparison with historical sources suggests that that's what it is. And you'll note that it's different from the other restorations I was talking about before. A Balagame, which is the most dramatic situation and has sadly been damaged by treasure hunters in at the end of last year, a Balagame, here we can see almost the full history of the aqueduct system from the 5th century up until its end, probably in the 12th century. Because here we have a sequence of medieval phases, characteristic of the 8th century and also characteristic of the 11th and 12th century. And in particular, what I want to point out is this stonework, which is very similar to what we saw from Balagame, and here the use of bricks probably deriving from the Anastasian wall, which is adjacent, and in particular the use of cloisonné brickwork, which is a characteristic form of construction of the Middle Byzantine period. So this is just to summarize that material. So there's Balagame, Byzantium down here. The samples are coming from there and one sample from down here. So what does this mean? Through a combination of the archaeological evidence, or the structural analysis, which I just briefly outlined, and a study of, we can have some insight, and a study of the carbonates, we can have some insight to demonstrate how the system was still maintained right up until the time of the Comnenian emperors. William of Malmesbury in 1098 records that when the Crusaders, the first crusade, arrived in the city, he records that the waters from the Danube, this was a trope which goes back to the Patria and the Arabs, were brought to the city. In other words, that's that long distance line from Thrace. Odo of Deu reports in the middle of the 12th century that was an abundance of fresh water, but doesn't say anything more. We also know, there's one strange reference associated with the Battle of Manzikert, that one of the emperor's closest colleagues was Vasileios Maleses, the Logothetes ton hidaton. It's the only time this particular role is mentioned, and it may or may not have a responsibility for the water, but I'd like to think it did. So what we're seeing from the carbonates then is a reflection in terms of the material evidence of the historical sources, which tell us this great, long, slightly over-length system was sustained up until the time of Manuel I Komnenos, when Kinemas tells us he noted that the arcades which conveyed water to Byzantium were long since collapsed, and that it would be a difficult task to reconstruct them, one requiring much time. And new sources were sought at Petra.
Okay, Jim.
So this is just one further insight into the history of the water supply, and it's part, and I conclude with this image from one of the latest Guadalumonte maps, and the only one which shows the water supply system in the city, the aqueduct of the Bozdan Khmer, but it is the Ottoman city, and this is the continuing part of the story. Thank you very much for your attention.